Welcome to the deep dive. We love unpacking these complex topics, and unearthing these fascinating insights.
All right.
And we're diving into the world of rock music today, but with a twist.
Oh,
Yeah, we're going beyond like the music itself to explore something that
yeah.
you might not really associate with this genre, sexism.
Huh. It is a curious paradox, isn't it?
Mm.
Rock music, this symbol of rebellion, freedom, has this history that's deeply intertwined with gender inequality.
It's not really what you would expect, right? Like you think of rock as breaking the rules, but then how did it become this space where women have had to fight so hard for their place? That's what we're going to explore today
Yeah.
using this academic paper we've got called Sexism in the Rock Music Industry.
Right. Yeah, this paper really digs deep into the historical roots of rock, and it's super interesting to see how this all played out in the post-World War II era.
Okay, so paint a picture for me. What was going on then that might have shaped like the early rock scene?
Well, imagine a world kind of grappling with the aftermath of this devastating war. Societal anxieties were high, traditional values were being questioned, and there was this surge of liberalism. It was like a breeding ground for change, and that's where rock music kind of exploded onto the scene.
So rock emerges as this voice of rebellion. But according to this research, the early scene was like heavily dominated by white men.
And that's a key point. Their experiences, their frustrations, their perspectives, it all just became the dominant narrative. It's not necessarily intentional, but it did shape the landscape of early rock and kind of contribute to the sidelining of women's voices.
So it seems like this inherent contradiction was there from the beginning. Rock, this genre that's all about challenging norms, also ends up like reflecting the existing power dynamics of the time.
Exactly. And that's kind of a thread that we'll see running through rock's history, this tension between pushing boundaries and inadvertently kind of perpetuating certain societal norms.
Now, there's this fascinating point in the research about male rock bands being portrayed as like saviors or figures of redemption, particularly in those early years.
Oh, yeah. Think of bands like the Beatles. They weren't just musicians. They were cultural icons, seen as offering a sense of hope and escape in a world that felt uncertain.
So they were almost given this like elevated status.
Yes. And this contributed to what the paper calls the feminization of male bands.
Okay, I'm going to need you to break that down for me because it sounds a bit counterintuitive.
It essentially means that male rock stars were allowed to exhibit traits that weren't typically associated with traditional masculinity. They could be vulnerable, sensitive, and even adopt a softer aesthetic.
So while men were allowed to explore these more nuanced expressions of masculinity, what was happening with women in rock at that time?
Well, they were facing a very different reality. While male bands were being celebrated for pushing boundaries, female rockers were often met with resistance and scrutiny.
And this research points to some early voices of resistance, like The Rat magazine, a feminist publication that wasn't afraid to call out sexism in the music industry.
Yeah. Their article is titled Cock Rock, is a really powerful example. It directly challenged that male-dominated narrative in rock and brought to light the experiences of early female rock groups who were often dismissed or ridiculed.
The paper mentions the band Rose and Licorice. They were a talented group, but they faced so many challenges just because they were women.
Right. They were judged on their appearance rather than their music. They were booed off stage, subjected to crude comments. Sadly, this was not an uncommon experience for female musicians during that era.
It's heartbreaking to think about the talent that might have been lost or silenced because of this hostile environment.
Yeah, it highlights the price many women had to pay for, daring to challenge the status quo in a male-dominated industry. They had to be incredibly resilient and determined just to get their foot in the door.
And even then, it wasn't always enough. Some women, according to the research, even chose to remain anonymous out of fear of backlash.
Wow, yeah, it shows how deep-seated the biases were. For some women, the risk of being identified as a female musician was simply too great.
But thankfully, some women did break through those barriers. And when we talk about female rock icons, one name that immediately comes to mind is Janis Joplin.
Yeah, Janis Joplin's rise to fame is a really pivotal moment in our deep dive into sexism in rock music. Her story is both inspiring and heartbreaking, showcasing the complexities of being a woman in this genre. She was a force of nature with this incredible raw talent and stage presence that just captivated audiences.
But what's interesting to me is how she navigated that male-dominated world. She embraced a lot of typically masculine traits in her performance style.
And that's a crucial point. Think about her powerful vocals, her raw emotion, her fearless stage presence. These were qualities that were often celebrated in male rock stars, but seen as almost threatening or out of place in women.
So in a way, she had to play by those masculine rules to gain acceptance.
Yeah, it speaks to the double standards at play. The very qualities that were seen as enhancing the image of male artists were often used to undermine or criticize female artists.
Yeah, it's frustrating to see how these biases permeated like the whole industry.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder if rock music truly embraced the idea of challenging norms, or if it was just selective about which norms were acceptable to challenge.
It's like they were breaking the rules, but only within certain limits.
Right, and those limits were often defined by a male-centric perspective. This shaped everything, from what was considered cool to what kind of music got airplay to who got signed to, record deals.
So how do we break free from these outdated notions?
Hmm.
How can we create a space where women in rock music are judged on their talent and not, on their gender?
I think it starts with awareness. We need to recognize how these biases continue to manifest, both consciously and unconsciously. For example, we were talking earlier about the underrepresentation of women in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
That's a perfect example. It's a prestigious institution, and yet it's historically failed to recognize the contributions of women in a way that reflects their actual impact on rock music.
And it's not just institutions, right? It's also about individual attitudes and behaviors.
Yeah. We all have a role to play in creating a more inclusive culture. It's about actively supporting female artists, speaking out against sexist comments, and questioning the assumptions we might hold about what constitutes a rock star.
It's about shifting the narrative, moving away from the idea that rock music is inherently masculine and embracing a more diverse and inclusive vision of, like, what rock can be.
And celebrating the incredible talent and contributions of women who've been shaping rock music for decades, often in the face of, tremendous adversity.
Now, I want to circle back to Janis Joplin for a moment, because her story really encapsulates the complexities of being a woman in rock music during that era.
Yeah, she's a fascinating figure, a true rebel who challenged conventions both musically and personally.
And she didn't shy away from expressing her struggles. There's this quote from her in that NPR article we read where she talks about how she was constantly being told to be more ladylike, to tone down her performances.
And yet she refused to conform. She embraced her raw energy, her vulnerability, and her sexuality in a way that was groundbreaking for a woman in rock at that time.
But she paid a price for that freedom, didn't she?
The research points to the intense scrutiny she faced, from the media and the public. Her personal life was often sensationalized, and her struggles with addiction were used to discredit her artistry.
It's a reminder that even the most successful women in rock music often had to navigate a minefield of double standards and societal judgments.
Judgments that often had more to do with their gender than their talent or contributions to the music.
It's sobering to realize how much progress still needs to be made. We've come a long way, but those biases are still lurking beneath the surface.
Exactly. We can't be complacent, We need to continue to challenge those biases and create a more equitable and just environment for all artists, regardless of their gender.
It's time to move beyond tokenism and embrace true equality.
Right. It's about recognizing that women aren't just a niche market within rock music.
They're integral to its history, its present, and its future.
Yeah. Their influence is undeniable, their voices are powerful, and their stories deserve to be at the forefront of the rock narrative.
This deep dive has been eye-opening. It's made me think about the music I listen to in a whole new light.
That's the power of exploring these complex issues. It challenges our assumptions and encourages us to be more critical and engaged consumers of culture.
And as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I'm curious to explore beyond Janis Joplin. We touched on the Rap magazine article, which mentioned some other early female rock groups. What can you tell us about them?
Well, one group that stands out is Fanny. They were a Filipino-American rock band back in the 70s, incredibly talented musicians who played their own instruments and wrote their own songs.
That's pretty remarkable for that time period.
It was. But despite their talent and critical acclaim, they struggled to gain mainstream recognition. They faced a lot of prejudice, being both women and women of color in a predominantly white male industry.
So even though they are breaking barriers, their journey highlights how those systemic biases were at play on multiple levels.
Exactly. And it underscores the importance of recognizing the intersectionality of these issues. Sexism, racism, homophobia, these forces often intertwine to create even greater challenges for marginalized artists.
Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about another fascinating aspect to the research, this idea of the male gaze and how it shaped the image and perception of women in rock.
Yeah. The male gaze is essentially the idea that women are often portrayed and perceived through a male lens, objectified and judged based on their appearance rather than their talent.
And how did this play out, specifically in rock music?
Well, it manifested in many ways, from album covers that sexualized female artists to music videos that focused on their bodies rather than their music, to the way they were, written about in the press.
So it created this pressure for women to conform to certain beauty standards and to prioritize their image over their artistry.
It put them in this impossible double bind. If they embraced their sexuality, they were labeled as provocative or attention-seeking. But if they tried to downplay their femininity, they were dismissed as not being rock enough.
It's like they couldn't win.
Yeah, and this pressure had a real impact on their careers. It limited their opportunities and often overshadowed their talent.
It's another example of how those deeply ingrained biases created a playing field that was tilted against women from the start.
And those biases didn't just come from men, Internalized sexism played a role as well.
What do you mean by that?
It means that women sometimes internalize those societal messages about their worth and their place in the world.
So they might unconsciously limit their own ambitions or conform to those expectations, even if they don't really want to.
It's a subtle but powerful force that can be really damaging.
This conversation is highlighting just how complex and multifaceted these issues are. It's not just about overt sexism.
Right. It's about all these subtle ways in which women have been marginalized and silenced in rock music.
And it's about recognizing those patterns and actively working to dismantle them.
Yeah, it's about creating a culture where women feel empowered to express themselves authentically without fear of judgment or backlash.
And where their talent is recognized and celebrated on its own merits without being filtered through the lens of gender or any other societal bias.
That's the vision we need to be striving for.
It's inspiring to think about the possibilities, but it's also clear that there's a lot of work to be done.
We're making progress, but we can't let up.
We need to keep pushing for change, both individually and collectively.
It's about holding institutions accountable, challenging sexist attitudes, and supporting those who are working to create a more inclusive and equitable music industry.
And it's about amplifying the voices of women in rock music, ensuring that their stories are heard, their contributions are recognized, and their legacy is preserved for generations to come.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've explored the historical roots of sexism in rock music, talked about the challenges faced by female artists and the ways in which those deeply ingrained biases have really shaped the industry.
Yeah.
And I think it's crucial to remember that this conversation isn't just about righting past wrongs, right? It's about creating a future where all artists, regardless of gender, have the opportunity to thrive.
I agree.
And while it's important to acknowledge, the historical context and those systemic barriers that still exist, it's equally important to celebrate the women who have broken down those barriers, defied expectations, and inspired generations.
The research does mention Janis Joplin as a pivotal figure. We've talked about her impact,
Right.
But she's just one example in this long line of incredible women who have shaped the sound and soul of rock music.
For sure.
So let's dive into some other trailblazers who deserve to be celebrated. This paper on sexism in the rock music industry only gives us a limited few.
Absolutely. Where do we even begin? There are so many inspiring stories. Let's go back to the very roots of rock and roll. Sister Rosetta Tharpe.
I've heard her name, but I'm not that familiar with her music. What's her story?
Sister Rosetta Tharpe was a true pioneer. She was a gospel singer and guitarist who, back in the 1930s and 40s, was already blending gospel, blues, and jazz elements into a sound that many consider to be a precursor to rock and roll.
Wow. So she was really ahead of her time.
Oh, she absolutely was. She was known for her powerful vocals and her electrifying guitar playing. She was one of the first artists to popularize the use of distortion on the electric guitar.
That's incredible. So she was breaking musical boundaries and gender barriers way before the term rock and roll even existed.
Exactly. And her influence is undeniable. She inspired generations of musicians, from Chuck Berry to Elvis Presley to Little Richard.
It's amazing how someone who is so groundbreaking could be uh, almost forgotten by mainstream music history.
Right. Yeah. It speaks to the need to re-examine those narratives, and to make sure that the contributions of women, especially women of color, are recognized and celebrated.
So Sister Rosetta Tharpe, she laid the groundwork. Who are some other women who picked up that torch and carried it forward?
Well, in the 60s, you have someone like Grace Slick with Jefferson Airplane. Her powerful vocals on songs like White Rabbit and Somebody to Love became anthems of the psychedelic rock era.
Yeah, she had such a unique voice and stage presence.
And she wasn't afraid to challenge convention. She was openly critical of the sexism she experienced in the music industry, and she used her platform to advocate for women's rights.
Then in the late 70s and 80s, you have artists like Chrissie Hynde with Pretenders and Joan Jett with Joan Jett and the Blackhearts. They brought this raw punk rock energy and attitude to the scene.
Yeah, they were both incredibly talented musicians who wrote and performed their own music. They defied expectations and paved the way for a whole generation of women in rock.
And what about the 90s? I know there was a lot happening then in terms of women in rock.
Absolutely. The 90s saw the rise of the Riot Girl movement, which was this, feminist punk rock movement that originated in Washington State.
Oh, right, yeah. What were some of the key bands associated with that movement?
Bands like Bikini Kill, Bratmobile, Sleater Kinney, and L7. They were known for their fierce feminist lyrics, their DIY ethos, and their powerful live performances.
Yeah, they really challenged that male-dominated punk scene, and it created a space for women to express their anger, their frustration, and their empowerment.
Yeah. And their influence extended far beyond music, too. They inspired a whole generation of young women to speak out against sexism, to challenge gender norms, and to create their own communities of support.
And these are just a handful of examples, of course. There are countless other women who have made incredible contributions to rock music throughout its history.
Exactly.
And it's on us, as music lovers, to seek them out, to listen to their music, to learn their stories, and to celebrate their legacy.
Right.
Because the more we amplify their voices, the more we challenge the narrative that rock music is just like a boys' club.
Yeah. It's about recognizing that women have always been an integral part of rock and roll, shaping its sound, its attitude, and its evolution.
So what's the takeaway from all of this? I think it's pretty clear that the fight for equality in rock music is far from over.
Yeah, but progress is being made, and there's reason to be optimistic.
While it's important to acknowledge, the historical context and the systemic barriers that still exist, it's equally important to celebrate the women who have broken down those barriers, defied expectations, and inspired generations.
Absolutely. Their stories are powerful, their music is transformative, and their legacy deserves to be honored.
Yeah. So let's keep listening, keep learning, keep challenging the status quo, and keep amplifying the voices of women in rock music.
Yes, because their voices matter, their music matters, and their stories deserve to be heard. And for you listening out there, I encourage you to dive deeper into the rich history of women in rock music. Explore those artists, those bands, those stories that might have been overlooked or overshadowed. You might just discover your new favorite band.
And as always, thanks for taking the deep dive with us.